Thank you, Luca. Thank you for the invitation to have this event. Thank you all for coming. So I was told that this is a good time to have such an event because people over the summer start scrambling and writing all the results that they had during the year. So that could be good preparation here. All right, so what I'm going to talk about, pretty much everything is in a document that I have on my website, so you can go back and refer to it. It's a document that I had put together about 10 years ago. At that time, I had a large group of 10 students, and instead of telling each one every time the same things, I decided it would be more efficient to put it on paper. I'm not sure they read it, but at least I did my part. All right, so writing is a serious business. Why is it? You can think about it in many different ways. Basically, you don't want to waste your own time. And wasting your own time, it means having to revise and resubmit a paper 3 times. It's better to get it right the first time, get it accepted, and be finished. It's more efficient. Also, there's efficiency on the other end of the communication channel. If the readers can understand what you're trying to say, then you get your message across. If people take your paper and set it aside after a few minutes, then you have not succeeded. So you have to take things seriously and think from the point of view of the people who will be reading it. Now, writing is complicated because when you write a document, there's many levels at which you can think of it. It's like a fractal. There's a high-level structure, the big idea you want to convey, but then there's lower-level structures and substructures. It's very much like music. You can think of music at different scales, and all of these interact, the macro and the micro, and one needs to spend time thinking about all those scales at the same time. All right, so what I'm going to do is start with some high-level advice about document structure and all that, and then start going down to the more pedantic and more pedantic elements, all the way to just a few things about typesetting. I'm going to skip a fair number of details that are in my document, but I'll try to pick and choose the most important ones. All right, so what's the highest level advice? The first thing is, do not think that your readers are super intelligent and can read your mind. Rather, you should assume that the readers are somewhat tired, maybe a little sleepy, and you have to make it an easy job for them, a pleasant job for them, to read through your document without having to stumble and try to decode all the time. So that's a key thing, and that goes with a psychological attitude. Be insecure. Do not be overconfident that my results are great, they speak for themselves and all that. Insecure means, okay, I have to really convince the others that I have something interesting to say and that I'm saying it in a loud and clear way. Now, another big advice is to look at documents that you enjoyed reading and sit down and think, why did I enjoy reading them? How do the masters do the job that they do? So in my own case, I was happy to interact and write a lot together with 2 great colleagues. With Dimitri, with Bertsikas, we have written a lot. And one of the things that I learned from Dimitri is to try to cut out as much junk or secondary material, just figure out what is the main idea and try to express it without things that are kind of second order and not so necessary. And from Christos Papadimitriou, I learned how to write kind of crisp sentences that kind of strike the reader, that have some rhythm, some smartness in them, that keep the reader alert, to make the reader feel happy even if they don't understand what they're reading. There's an art that goes there. And it's always good to refer, for example, to Nash's famous paper on games, which is just a page and a few lines beyond that, which is like a gem. It's a very crisp document, says exactly what needs to be said, nothing more than that. All right, and then the next piece of advice is, before you sit down in front of your computer, instead spend a lot of time thinking about what you're trying to do. So what is it you should be thinking about? It's important to know what your audience is. It's one thing to write a tutorial for undergraduates. It's a different thing to write for a machine learning conference. It's a different thing to write for the annals of mathematics or whatever. There's different styles. There's different assumptions you need to make about what your audience knows and understands. So it's good to actually have an image of a concrete person and saying, I'm writing my paper for Luca to read it. And I have some assumptions about what Luca knows and what doesn't know, and gear it in that direction. Another important question is, why are you writing this paper? Okay. What is it that you want to say? It's not just because you managed to collect 30 or 40 pages of lemmas and results. It's because you have a message to convey. There should be some key takeaways that would be the elevator pitch, and have that clear in your mind. What, after someone reads your paper, what are the 3 things that they should remember? And use that as the anchor that guides the rest of your writing. Okay, next step, again, before you sit down on your computer, write on pencil or pen on paper very precise statements of the theorems or the lemmas that you are going to establish. Typesetting and thinking do not go very well together. It's good to separate the two of them without having to deal with your keyboard. Just have the exact statements of the results that you're going to have. And in order to have exact statements of your results, of course, you also need your notation. You're going to save a lot of time in the long run if you just put aside one sheet of paper and records all the notations that you will be using. Of course, as you write the paper, your choices of notation might change, but at any time there should be one set of clear notations that you are using, and think about the choices that you have there. So a choice that I particularly like is that to say the convention, random variables will be with capital letters, real values will be with lowercase letters. Decide if you want to keep that convention, write it and keep using it, make a list of the random variables that are going to show up in your document, and so on. And if you have processes that evolve in time or functions, you have a choices of notation. They have pros and cons. Decide ahead of time. Don't use this notation in half of the paper and switch to x parenthesis t in the other half of your paper. You'll drive your readers crazy. So make those decisions ahead of time. And avoid stuff like this. Okay, double subscripts, sometimes they're unavoidable, but sometimes many times there's ways to avoid them. Keep the notation as simple as possible. All right, and in the same way as with notation, decide on what words you're going to use. Just too many times I've had to edit papers where the abstract talks about agents and then the rest of the paper starts to talk about nodes. Okay, just decide once and for all, are you going to call them agents or will you call them nodes? The stuff that connects two nodes, you could call them links, arcs, edges, whatever, I don't care, but just pick one of those and stick to it. Okay, it sounds a bit trivial, but actually if you don't make a conscious decision in the beginning, you will find yourself drifting between different words. Just at a low level, some people like to spell queuing this way, some people like to spell queuing that way. I'm fine with either, although I prefer the first, but just make that decision and stay consistent. Now, why does that matter? To some extent, when I'm editing a student's paper, my mental energy should go into checking the details of the proofs and not be distracted by correcting hyphens here and there. And so just in the interaction with your co-authors or your advisors, it's good to get all those trivial details out so that one can focus on the substance. All right, so once you start, again on paper, you should write down the high-level outline of your document. Usually in our field, it's pretty standard the way that things are structured. There's these key components. And within those components, again, you want to think of them in a modular way. So a section on results might be 10 or 15 pages. You want to break it up into subsections, sub-subsections, and all that, and use lots of headings. Having headings in bold really helps the reader kind of visualize the high-level structure of what's going on. Whereas if you have 5 straight pages of calculations and prose, the reader starts to get lost, and you need to help people orient themselves. So I'm thinking of titles in sub-subsections. Basically, they're signposts. Where are we now, and what are we doing? And ideally, each one, there shouldn't be anything more than 2 or 3 pages that's just text after text after text. And each one of those modules should have a clear purpose. It should be clear in your mind when you sit down and write it. What am I going to do in this subsection? What is it that I'm going to deliver? And help the reader by telling them, you can always try to start a subsection with this boring type of sentence. In this subsection, we will deliver A, B, C, and then go ahead and deliver them. So as you can see, almost everything I'm going to say, after you hear it, it's kind of trivial, obvious, not particularly deep, but it's good to keep it in mind and be systematic when you go into that business. All right, so let's start from the beginning. We start with the abstract. So here's an abstract. I took a real paper and paraphrased it so that you cannot tell what it was. So what would you say about this type of abstract? It starts by saying reinforcement learning does this, blah, 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 and then it says in this paper we do this. So how many people like this kind of structure? How many dislike it? Okay, so majority wins that they dislike it. Yeah, what I really dislike about an abstract of this kind is that the abstract is supposed to just say, in this paper we do such and such. Editorializing, commentary, discussion about the literature and philosophy and all that does not belong to an abstract. So all that blue stuff should not be there. Instead, the abstract should be very crisp and clear. Such as, this is kind of an example, we consider this and that, we establish results 1, 2, 3, and by the way, we solved an open problem. Right, as opposed to this boilerplate that people often do, this kind of sounds the way 100 other people wrote papers on this topic without really knowing why. I'm also writing a paper on this topic without knowing why, just because in recent years many other people wrote papers. Okay, just avoid this in these recent years. Just be simple, crisp, go directly to the point. Don't say more than needs to be said. Then we move to the introduction. Unfortunately, that's what most people will read and then kind of start stopping or lose energy. So your introduction has to be really nice. Now, when you think about what you're writing in the introduction, it's all pretty simple in your mind. So there's a temptation that you just sit on your computer and just write whatever comes to your mind that has some relevance to the landscape of your paper. But actually, it's very useful to write down on paper what are the bullet points that you are going to say, and each bullet point should be roughly 1 paragraph. And this way you can keep your paragraphs distinct. A different paragraph should have a different message from the previous paragraph. Don't keep a theme running across paragraphs. Don't keep your messages tangled, but keep them arranged and each one having a particular function. So these days it's pretty common to give a preview of the main results in the beginning for those people who are not going to read the rest. Usually that's not going to be a precise theorem statement, but you describe in words our main results are 1, 2, 3, and sometimes if it's in a crowded field you want also to to say exactly what's new and what are the key contributions. The contributions could be more than theorems, could be we have formulated for the first time a model of such and such a kind and so on. These two, sometimes you can interleave them, sometimes you want to keep them separately. There's a choice to be made, but again the point that I'm making is that there are choices to be made, there are simple choices, but you have to make them consciously. Don't just go with the flow and see what comes out. And it's good to conclude the introduction section with some guide of what's going to happen next, what's happened in each one of the subsequent sections. Now, within sections, you think again that sections are going to consist of modules of different types, and keep them in your mind as being separate. That is, do not have a paragraph that has some motivation, some discussion of a counterexample, and some discussion of what other people did. These are different items. Keep them in separate paragraphs. So the section typically should start with, in this section we will, blah blah, and this complements the results in the previous section, and so on. So again, give the reader a sense of where we are now and where we're moving to. Give a little bit of discussion so that the readers know where it's going, some details, whatever is necessary. And then a typical structure would be that you have a theorem. It's good to have a paragraph if your theorem is complicated or non-trivial that gives an interpretation, what exactly it says, what it doesn't say. It's sometimes good to give a separate paragraph that gives the idea of the proof. That's something that belongs outside the proof, but says the proof that follows involves a sequence of steps in which we do A, B, C, so that the reader has the high-level view. I mean, one can always read proofs by going line by line and see if the next line follows from the previous one, but then you kind of get lost. To understand the proof, you really need to extract the high-level picture. Any proof should be summarized in a sequence of 3 to 10 bullet points. You need to have those bullet points in your mind, and instead of having the reader discover what those 10 bullet points are, it's even better to just tell them. That's the sequence of high-level steps that happen inside the proof. Now, something that's very important whenever you have a mathematical statement is to talk about the counterexamples. If I remove this assumption, the theorem fails, and here's how it fails. Counterexamples kind of give you the boundary conditions for that theorem. When is it true and when it is not? Examples of a special case where one can really understand, oh, that's why it is true. Examples are also important. And don't shy away from figures. Even though they can take a lot of time to draw in a computer, you can give a lot of intuition by giving a nicely chosen figure. And something I learned from Dimitri is that it's okay to have a figure be an entire story. You can have a caption that's lots of lines, and it's a self-contained story, the figure together with the text underneath the figure. Not everybody does that, but sometimes it works well, and it's sort of an independent piece that you can look at and read on its own. It's like an example with an illustration. All right, now the heart of course, of math stuff are proofs. And usually we discover proofs by thinking backwards. That's what I want to prove. In order to prove that, I will try to prove this intermediate result and that intermediate result, and to do that I will need to establish a few lemmas. So we go backwards. But it's very hard to read the long proof and understanding and check correctness if it goes in this backward way. So proofs should be written in a linear way. Of course, in the beginning you can have a discussion that perhaps you might have a comment like this outside the proof, just to give the understanding of how the thinking goes, but the actual proof that can be checked and verified needs to go in a linear way. So we would have our lemmas, then use the lemmas to establish the next lemma, and finally use that to establish the final result. It's very hard to keep track arguments that are kind of incomplete, where you suddenly stop and you say, oh, for this statement to be true, we will need to prove something else, but that something else, I'm going to give it to you in 3 pages later, and all that. It's hard to follow and verify once you go non-linear. So stay linear is a big rule to follow. Of course, as I said, outlining the thinking that goes into it is something that you should do before starting the writing of the proof. Now, there's another kind of style that sometimes happens in textbooks as well, which is you start discussing blah blah, we have this and we have that and we have that, and now, oh, we just proved this result, rabbit out of the hat, and you impress your reader. I think that sometimes people do that when they prove Poincaresque or Jekyll or Fermat's theorem. They did that thing. It was a talk that it wasn't clear where it was going, and then you impress your audience. But unless you are doing something that big, it's better to tell the reader ahead of time what you will be proving, instead of keeping them in suspense. Okay, now, somewhat of an exception to the linearity is that we send some stuff to appendices. But this, in a logical sense, things are still linear. So your main text would have lemmas A, B, C, D. Perhaps the proof of lemma B is sent to an appendix, but the reader can still read that linearly, and if they want to check the technical details, they will go to the appendix and check them. It's important that the main text should be readable in a self-contained way. I'm willing to accept that the proof of the lemma is correct, which is in the appendix, and I keep reading, and each step then follows from the other step. You should be able to read the main text without flipping to the appendices. That is, the main text should not have a statement that says by lemma A3 in appendix C, because then you would be forced to flip to that lemma. Whatever lemma is used in the main development of the theorem should be in the main text. Whatever lemma is referred to in the main text should be stated in the main text. The statement should not be in the appendix. Okay, now something that sometimes causes me pain is that I read something and then a miracle happens or something like that. I do not see how the next sentence follows from the previous sentence. And I spent 15 minutes trying to reconstruct it and check the algebra and all that, and all the time thinking maybe it's something completely obvious that I'm missing. Well, sometimes people skip steps, and it's fine to skip steps, but you should alert the reader. At this point, I'm skipping steps, believe me, it's true. You shouldn't leave the reader wondering, am I stupid, is it something I don't see, or should I need some work? So in such cases, it's best to say, by a short argument that's omitted here, or after a moderately tedious algebraic computation, whatever, just tell the reader that there is stuff that's been hidden so that they know that this is the case, that they understand that indeed there is stuff there, and maybe they want to reconstruct it, maybe not. So it's really a lot of pain when you're trying to see how the next step follows from the previous step, and you're not quite told if that's a one-line calculation that's omitted, or is it a half-a-page calculation that's omitted. That's very important from the point of view of the reader. It's also very important from the point of view as the writer, because most of the mistakes that are made in papers happen when you skip steps. You consider something to be obvious, but just because you didn't write it down explicitly, you might be missing some subtle detail that makes your argument to be incorrect. All right, so now let's move on to one level lower in the execution part and talk about language. All right, so here's one possible translation of who recognizes the text. Okay, good. All right, so this is one long sentence from The Stranger, the opening words from The Stranger by Camus. And it's one sentence. On today, I do not for sure, as it could be this, based on that, blah, blah, blah. Well, the Nobel Prize winning version is that, which consists of a few short sentences. I guess that was a style that came into life, it's been quite some time ago. Some people called it the American style of writing literature, which is with short but to the point sentences. Now, in literature, of course, there's examples at the other extreme. You can read Proust and have sentences that go for an entire page. And that's fine in literature because they try to evoke a stream of thoughts that kind of moves and flows. But math is different. It's not supposed to work by feeling. It's supposed to work in a different way. And for math, the rule is whenever you see a long sentence, try to break it up and try to make it into a sequence of shorter, crisp sentences. Don't write a long sentence that says this, and also this, because this and that, and keep flowing that way. So it's enough strain on your brain to try to understand the math. You shouldn't have the extra strain of trying to parse a complicated sentence. So long sentences should be broken up. Just write with short sentences. Especially, of course, if English is not your native language, that's even one more reason to keep it short and simple. Other stuff about language. Okay. I have a preference for we show instead of it is shown. If you write your whole paper in this passive voice, you start getting into awkward phrases that do not quite feel right. So the we is a good word to use. Okay, now here's an example or counter example. So what's wrong with this sentence? It. Yeah. What is that it? Now, the person who wrote that sentence and the reader who understands the paper, of course, understands that the dispatcher receives the message and then the dispatcher is going to store the information in the header. But that requires thinking. You shouldn't need to do all that thinking to parse that sentence. It should be so much simpler to say, when a message from a server arrives to the dispatcher, comma, the dispatcher stores the header. Your English teacher might not be thrilled by the repetition of the word dispatcher next to itself so closely, but it saves a lot of effort in interpreting. So pronouns are basically pointers, but whenever you have the word it, sometimes it's ambiguous. There's many nouns before that it, and that it could be a pointer here, it could be a pointer there. Whenever there's even a remote chance of ambiguity, you just make it explicit. What is it that you're pointing at? So that's a very common kind of mistake. All right, so here's another counterexample. What's wrong with this? Okay, many things that are wrong. If we define this, okay, so you're telling me there's a hypothetical universe where we might define it that way, but actually we're not defining that way. What is it that you're trying to tell me? All right, and then this, we have that. Here your English teacher would be really annoyed for good reason. Okay, why not just say if x equals 2y, then 2x equals 4y? It's saying exactly the same thing as that long statement with half as many words. Moral of this, look at every sentence after you're happy with the math, that everything is correct, and see what words are unnecessary, and just get rid of them. The shorter, the better. By the way, this this point also applies to sentences as well. You have a long paragraph that's saying stuff. Look at each one of the sentences in that paragraph and think, is this sentence saying something new? Is it really needed, or can I get rid of it? Whenever in doubt, just get rid of it. So the less, the better. Try to convey your message in the simplest possible way. Okay, here's another example. What's wrong with this one? Okay, too many words rests on the idea of employing. The proof employs a triangle inequality. You don't need the rest. So these are actual examples from my proofreading of the last 2 weeks. So, and it's very common. I mean, it's not a big deal. Nobody's going to reject your paper because you had that kind of statement, but it's good to be in the frame of mind, remove anything that's redundant and stick to the substance. And apply that lesson also to the higher level, not just to the individual sentence level, but also to cutting sentences or even cutting remarks and side points and things that are not really necessary for the core of your paper. Okay, that's another example in the same vein. It's a true example. Okay, what would you cut here? Well, using lemma 3, lemma follows. What do you mean the result in lemma 3? Okay. All right, so you get the idea. The only exception where I am in favor of putting something that could be cut is this thing. In common language we would say, oh, assume n is an integer, and everybody understands what we mean, but it kind of flows nicer to say assume that n is an integer, and it, depending on if it's inside a more complicated sentence, it does help a lot to parse that sentence if you have the words that in the right places. All right, now let's switch from English to math. I said that proofs should be done linearly, that is, the pieces of a proof should be linear. To help the reading of whatever you wrote, it's also nice that individual sentences or pairs of sentences are also linear. And here's what I mean. Okay, suppose we have this great lemma that if n is even, then n is a composite number. By lemma 1, 2k is composite because 2k is even. So that's also a true statement. Lemma 1 applies because 2k is even, because it's okay. And because of that, 2k is a composite number. So this is non-linear in the sense that this sentence at the end is the sentence that is really saying the conditions of lemma 1 are satisfied, and therefore by lemma 1 2k is composite. That's the logical structure of the argument. So you should write it in that way, following the logical structure. Note that 2k is even, so the condition is satisfied. Therefore by lemma 1 the conclusion follows. So write things in exactly the way things are going, as opposed to saying an even worse case would be a statement like, because condition A holds, lemma 2 applies, and this is because conditions D also holds. That is, you're justifying a statement, and the justification has two parts, and you put one part of the justification in the beginning, one part at the end. Okay, it's all understandable by someone who is going to spend time trying to understand what you're saying, but the key point is that your reader should not have to make any effort to disentangle what you're writing. And writing things linearly is the best way to go about it. So the ideal statements are statements of the form, if such and such is true, then such and such is true. Therefore, such and such follows, and so on. keep going in this linear way. Or define this term to mean that, or to be this, and then we apply lemma and shows that. As opposed to saying lemma 2 implies such and such, where x was defined to be. Okay, sometimes we do that with the where we put a justification afterwards if the sentences would be awkward otherwise, but you do that only when you're forced to do it. If you're not forced to do it, start first by defining the terms and then giving the statement that uses those terms. So ideal lemmas and theorems should be short, ideally one line. Okay. Okay. Every Hilbert space is a Banach space, period. That's your theorem. The definition of a Hilbert space and the Banach space belong outside the theorem. Definition should be outside. And then the comment as a corollary, L2 spaces are Banach spaces. That's a comment. It belongs outside the theorem. It should not be in the theorem. So the theorem should be made as compact as possible by defining notions, notations, concepts, all that outside them. And the theorem should be the gem or the central point. Okay, something else about math language. Here's some nice variety for all even integers, and this property holds. However, that property holds if n is odd. Okay. Maybe it has some variety in terms of language if you were writing a novel, but if you're writing math, the reader will feel much more at peace if the two sentences are exactly parallel. For even ones, that's true. For odd ones, that's true. I do not have to make any effort to translate that statement and turn it around and compare it with the first statement. So these parallel constructions, even to have, if you have two slightly different theorems with two different conditions in two different parts of your paper, it would be nice to have the theorems structured in exactly the same way so that one can compare them and see what assumptions are different and what assumptions are the same. Just try to follow templates. You will not get a literary masterpiece this way, but you will get something that's easier to understand and follow. And finally, whenever you have math inside the text, math should be like something that you can articulate using the English language. So how do you read that? For every 1 less than k less than 10. What does it mean for every 1? No, never do that. Unfortunately, here you would have to say something longer. For every k in the range from 1 to 10, or for every k belongs to the set 1 to 10, something like that. Of course, we all understand what this means, but you feel kind of psychologically annoyed or unsettled when you read for every 1 less than k. All right. So that's a good rule to follow. Math should read like English. Okay. Now, perhaps a very common recurring point. So in choosing what to talk about, I kind of picked those things that do happen all the time. And one of them has to do with ambiguities about quantifiers. So look at that statement. For every n, we have n less than c for some c. Okay? Sounds reasonable. If I pick c big enough, n is going to be less than c. But this statement can be interpreted in two different ways. For every n, there exists some c such that n is less than c. That's the for some. Or for some c, that is, there exists some c, such that for every n, we have n less than c. So in one statement is for every there exists, the other one is there exists for every. They're two different statements. If you just write it this way, it's not clear which one of the two you mean. Now, if you understand the context and enough math, you will understand that it's the first statement because the second one is clearly false. But the reader should not have to spend the time thinking, is it this or is it that? Just write the correct statement. So unambiguous statements, unfortunately, will need to have all the quantifiers in the beginning. You cannot putting the quantifier there exists C, if you put it at the end of the sentence, it's ambiguous what is the scope of that quantifier. So you shouldn't do that. Now, this phenomenon of unclear quantifiers unfortunately happens a lot once you start using this order of magnitude notation. What does a statement, so T is the running time of some algorithm, and you have a theorem that T is order of n to the d, where n is number of data points and d is the dimension. That's a typical kind of statement in a statistical paper. What does it mean? Order of magnitude notation means there exists a constant such that eventually, except for the beginning, you have an inequality of this kind. Okay, there exists a constant. There exists a constant depending on what? Here's one interpretation. There exists a constant such that for all large enough n and d, we have this. That's one possible interpretation. That's another interpretation. A statistician who says, let us fix the dimension of the problem. In that dimension, for any fixed dimension, there exists some C that depends on the dimension, such that for all n large enough, we have this relation. So the difference between these two statements is that here C is an absolute constant, here C is a constant that depends on the dimension. They're very different statements. How can you distinguish between the two statements? You basically need to say very explicitly which one of the two you mean. Whenever you have this order of magnitude notation and multiple variables inside there, you have to make it very clear which variables are considered to be sort of fixed and whether you're talking about the dependence on n or the dependence on both n and d. Ultimately, the only way to be perfectly clear is to unfortunately write it in full. You might say our result is the following, that's the short statement, by which more precisely, and then give the whole words. And it's important to do that because these are two fundamentally different statements. Sometimes you can save it by adding here, by saying there exists some universal constant C, and something like that. And there exists a universal constant C such that T is less than that. That almost gives the idea of what you mean, although universal constant is not a very mathematical statement. What's the difference between a constant and a universal constant? I mean, it just helps the reader a little bit when you use that word universal, but if you want to be very precise, it actually doesn't. So be very wary, worry a lot about order of magnitude notation to make sure what it is, what exactly you're claiming. Unfortunately, especially in conference papers of the type that get produced the night before the deadline, they tend to be full of this kind of stuff. All right, and now as we move down to lower and lower levels, there's lots of little bits of advice about typesetting. The list is infinite. I'll just pick some samples that come to my mind. One is, do not use inline fractions. They're ugly. They mess up with the fonts. You get things that look small when they shouldn't. So inline fractions should not be displayed this way. They should be displayed that way. It's just more beautiful. Doesn't mess up with the spacing. Another one is to always help the reader parse long expressions. So what's wrong with this one? It's a conditional expectation, but the conditioning is that thin line somewhere in the middle, and your eye has to work a lot to kind of identify it and split that in two pieces. How about this? Just add some space here and there so that the two pieces are separate from each other. It's a trivial point. Pretty much everything I've said is trivial. But this saves mental effort for the reader, and your work is to make everything as easy as possible for the reader so that they don't have to spend time on the annoying stuff, just concentrate their mental effort on the math and nothing else. Okay, and if you look at the document on my website and also the references in the next slide, they have long lists of do's and don'ts of this type for the low-level kind of writing. So there's a Dimitri, long time ago, had a talk pretty much of this flavor. Now, Dimitri used the advice that I didn't follow, which is to figure out really what is your message, and he concentrated it on 10 rules, whereas I gave you just a laundry list of rules. So there's very good useful points there. Of course, one of the rules is to write linearly, the other rule is to write modularly, and so on. Knuth is, of course, the most, yes, the person like one can think of if you're trying to think of someone who's obsessive with detail and perfection. And so he has a huge document about writing, but at least in the beginning there's concise stuff about do's and don'ts. And one of the things that he's saying is never use "we have that x equals to 3." Never, we just say "we have x equals to 3." That has been a topic of lots of debates between authors and co-authors. Okay, I go with Knuth and says don't put the word "that" in that place. And Halmos has a beautiful essay that has quite a bit of humor and examples of do's and don'ts. It's very pleasant evening reading. Okay, so I'll stop here. I guess we have time for questions or thoughts or reactions.
I have ever happened to you that you found yourself running out of notation, like with the English alphabet and Greek alphabet and tilde?
Yes, sometimes you do kind of run out of notation, especially you start exhausting the letters for integers. You have I, J, K, L, M, N, and then you need one more, and then you have to be creative, but you never really run out. It's just that you have to sit down and spend time thinking.
Is it true that we should use even if we are writing like single author paper?
You don't want to say I in your paper. It's not polite. Yeah. So you can imagine writing your paper. So this paper shows that blah, blah. The next step in the proof is you can manage without the we, but at some point you find that it starts becoming clumsy. And I doesn't sound, yeah, it's... Yeah?
You had an example, thing where you discussed that the figure could be an independent student. I
Yes.
didn't quite get how it worked. You meant to explain the entire figure in the captions and not in the text.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, we found it useful in many... So you can have the figure and then discussion in the text about what's happening in the figure. But if it's completely self-contained, so the figure would be geometrical interpretation of that proof. Has the figure, and underneath it says this segment is that is that, because those things are orthogonal, things are happening that way, and the figure can be read independently of everything else.
I guess I've seen those in books.
It fits more in books, but it's an option to consider in papers as well. It's less common in papers. Right. All right. Thank you.